Meat production, particularly of beef, is a major contributor to global warming. The methane expelled by cattle and other farm animals accounts for around 14% of all human-induced climate emissions. The industry is also a significant factor in deforestation, particularly in Brazil, where vast swathes of Amazonia have been cleared for grazing. So should more be done to rein in those responsible, or should consumers change their habits? We've been to Brazil to find out.
As the world tries to get to grips with the climate crisis amid rising cases of extreme weather, attention has largely focused on CO2 emissions from coal, gas and oil. But methane produced by cattle is one of the biggest causes of global warming. It reacts faster than CO2 and is considerably more harmful.
Methane is 80 times more damaging than CO2. And beef production is the leading cause of deforestation.
But if climate activists accuse the global meat industry of threatening the future existence of us all, it's already a matter of life and death in Brazil for the indigenous people trying to protect what's left of the Amazon rainforest.
We've seen an explosion in the numbers of killings of indigenous people in recent years.
Communities with deep ancestral ties to this extraordinary ecosystem are being pushed off their land to make way for cattle.
The world needs to think about the protection these people that are in danger because they are fighting for the forest.
At this year's carnival in Rio, the celebrations had an optimistic flavour. The election of President Lula da Silva has given fresh hope to indigenous people that something may now be done to stop the destructive incursions into their territories, which the previous government had either ignored or promoted. But it won't be easy. On January the 8th, 2023, just days after Lula's inauguration, supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro stormed the capital in an attempt to overturn the election result. Many of them are believed to have had links to the land invaders.
Então, para nós, estava muito claro essa relação, desde o início. Não à toa que, quando, à época, o presidente Jair Bolsonaro venceu as eleições,
existe sim indícios de ligação entre alguns líderes desse movimento que nós chamamos de terrorista, desse movimento golpista, né, e a sua ligação com alguns atores da agropecuária na Amazônia.
With Bolsonaro no longer in power and the failure of his supporters to turn back the clock, in theory, things should improve. Brazil, which contains roughly 2/3 of the Amazon rainforest and other important biomes, is home to an astonishing array of wildlife. As well as a last refuge for many endangered species, these habitats are quite literally the lungs of our planet.
Now we know that the importance of this place. To me, this place, the Amazon, it's the most important place in the world.
But the age-old struggle between indigenous people and cattle ranchers continues to take its toll on an ecosystem vital in the fight against global warming.
They move into a new area, log the area for precious timber, clear the remaining vegetation, often plant pasture, and then that will eventually become cattle ranches.
Quite apart from the deforestation, the methane emissions from these animals has become a major driver of climate change. In the last few decades, a handful of corporations have established slaughterhouses and meat processing plants throughout the Amazon, churning out vast quantities of meat, much of which is destined for consumption in Europe and the US. And the ever-growing herds of cattle necessary to maintain output are producing millions of tons of methane.
It's the biggest source of methane emissions, and it's also responsible for the most deforestation. So this is really something that if we are to stay below 1.5 degree temperature increase, we have to reduce production of livestock.
According to a report published by Changing Markets and the IATP, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, methane emissions from just 15 meat and dairy conglomerates surpass those of Russia and equate to more than 80% of the EU's methane footprint.
These companies are also responsible for huge amounts of CO2. If you put them together, their CO2 emissions, that would be the 10th biggest country as a climate polluter.
There are now 1.5 billion cows worldwide, and global cattle herds have increased by 561 million since the 1960s. A cow expels up to 300 litres of methane every day, and according to the UN, cows and other farm animals account for around 14% of human-induced climate emissions. But there is big money to be made in the meat and dairy business, and no effective measures are in place to curb the industry.
Projections are that meat production would increase by 50% by 2050. So it's growing.
Most meat is eaten in affluent countries. The typical European eats twice the global average, while in the US the rate is even higher. This, campaigners say, is having disastrous consequences.
If we don't reduce consumption and production of meat and dairy, we can say goodbye to 1.5. That's very clear.
The front line of the battle to contain methane emissions is in the Amazon rainforest. These pictures were taken from private WhatsApp groups, shared by land grabbers that invade indigenous territory, deforest vast areas and establish cattle farms. At times, indigenous inhabitants who by law own this land have even been killed defending their property.
No government has ever prioritized protecting indigenous rights and make sure that there's enough oversight to keep criminal activity outside these lands.
Comunidades quilombolas, né, a fronteira do desmatamento, infelizmente, voltou a entrar a Amazônia adentro. E o Estado, infelizmente, nos últimos anos, não fez quase nada para conter a fronteira.
Indigenous people had to act themselves to protect their forest.
Então, infelizmente, a gente voltou a ter um clima de quase guerra, basicamente, né?
Against that backdrop of state neglect, Brazil's meat companies expanded into the Amazon and became the biggest in the world. This processing plant belongs to Brazilian meat giant Marfrig, the world's biggest hamburger producer, which supplies many global brands such as McDonald's and Burger King. Nevertheless, according to its promotional video, Marfrig's business model is good for the environment.
We are committed to the sustainability of our businesses. We strive for excellence in everything we do.
Marfrig has publicly insisted it doesn't purchase livestock inappropriately raised on lands belonging to indigenous tribes. It's a claim critics dispute. These include the Mickey people of Mato Grosso state, who for centuries have lived in harmony with the rainforest, cultivating cassava, gathering fruit and hunting. They say the arrival of cattle has caused serious problems.
Meu pai, avô morava a dia. Fazendeiro entrando, a criar boi, lavoura. Aqui a pouco não tem mato, então, não tem mais mato. E nós temos chove.
The Mickey territory is shrinking fast as expanding cattle herds gobble up their forest.
A gente vê muita desmatação e criação de gados no território sagrado, né, que é nosso, né, que realmente eles tomaram da gente. Né. Então a gente investigou, né, que a empresa que estava comprando o gado, né, que está dentro da TI é a Marfrig, né. Ela compra e revende, né, para o exterior.
A lot of these ranches and farms that might be in conflict with indigenous communities, they will become integrated in global markets through the sales of their cattle to very large slaughterhouses or very large traders that will then export these commodities.
We wanted to ask Marfrig about its policies on deforestation, but the company did not agree to an interview or a statement. But on its website it says, "We are committed to making our production chain 100% deforestation free by 2030. Critics point out that this can also be interpreted as a tacit admission that it currently processes cattle from deforested land.
Cattle ranching is such a driver of deforestation as the next 6 commodities combined. So it is huge, their environmental footprint.
Take a look at satellite images of the Amazon, and it soon becomes clear that the only forest remaining intact is that still occupied by indigenous people.
As terras indígenas, elas funcionam como uma grande barreira para conter o avanço do desmatamento. Então, se você pega, por exemplo, o mapa, uma imagem da Amazônia, você vai ver que as terras indígenas, elas, apesar de sofrerem vários ataques de invasores, elas continuam com a floresta em pé.
Despite numerous death threats from land invaders, Nadina has campaigned against deforestation for over 50 years.
Hoje você tem os jovens indígenas fazendo a proteção do seu território, utilizando drone, máquinas fotográficas, filmadoras, fazendo denúncia nas redes sociais, né?
All the same, it's a desperate battle. Fires started deliberately to clear forests for cattle can devastate huge areas. This is a common sight we encountered in Mato Grosso and Rondônia, 2 of the Brazilian provinces most affected by deforestation. Dry timber is being laid out, ready for the burning season. The fires of 2020 were the worst on record.
E todos nós, cientistas, gestores, sabíamos que esse seria um ano com possíveis fogo. Então, a intensidade do fogo foi muito grande e pegou toda a natureza de uma forma desprevenida. Então, houve uma mortalidade muito grande de animais.
One of the worst affected regions was the Pantanal in Mato Grosso, the largest wetland in the world. It's a jaw-droppingly beautiful wilderness with an extraordinary abundance of biodiversity. Like the Amazon just to the north, much of it is endangered.
Hyacinth macaw is the biggest macaw in the world. They live here in the Pantanal, and probably you have a bit more than 3,000 individuals left in the world.
Aliton Lara has been a guide on the Pantanal for 20 years and had never seen anything like the fires of 2020. An estimated 7 million animals perished. He blames the cattle ranchers.
Almost 100% of the fire in the Pantanal was put by ranchers. They wanted to clear the land in an easier way. It burned about 26% of the Pantanal.
We filmed several large herds of cattle in the Pantanal. But ranching isn't the only threat to this unique ecosystem. Some developers are even talking of draining the Pantanal in order to grow soya, which would then be used to feed livestock.
O Pantanal é uma das áreas que ainda existe grandes regiões de terras com preços baratos. Porque toda a região que envolve a produção de soja, o valor da terra é muito alto, né? Então, há interesse, sim, desses grupos virem para o Pantanal.
Anyone who thinks that clearing forest to grow soy shames vegetarians as much as meat eaters would be wrong.
90% of soy goes into animal feed. So you really should not blame vegans for deforestation.
In fact, much of Mato Grosso has already been turned over to soy production. Where once there was rainforest, now enormous deserts of soy stretch into the horizon. The region once sucked up huge volumes of CO2. Now its net emissions of the greenhouse gas are greater than that it absorbs. If you add to this the fact that vast quantities of herbicide are sprayed onto the crop, poisoning nearby rivers, and that soy is also grown on land once held by indigenous people, it's easy to see how trouble begins.
Beef and soy, these are two major economic activities often linked to these kinds of land conflicts in Brazil.
But the drive for ever higher profits and bigger exports appears unstoppable. JBS, the world's largest meat company, is Brazil's other beef colossus, with abattoirs like this one throughout the Amazon. It has a turnover of $71 billion. Its customers include McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, and many other Western household names.
If you look at their methane emissions, they compare to combined methane emissions of entire livestock sector of Canada, France, Germany, and New Zealand. And these are all countries that produce huge amounts of meat and dairy.
The sheer scale of JBS's global operations is simply mind-boggling. Yet its corporate video makes no mention of the company's vast methane footprint. And critics allege that despite the company's claims to be helping to reduce deforestation, JBS maintains its enormous output by using beef cattle raised on once indigenous-owned land. In fact, 80% of cleared lands in the Brazilian Amazon are now populated by cattle. These illegal farms are situated within the Uruú-Uauau territory in the state of Rondônia.
Eles desmataram, colocaram gado e estão invadindo cada vez mais a terra indígena. O que acontece? A JBS não deveria comprar gado que, pelo menos ela disse que não compra, não deveria comprar gado que fosse gado ilegal.
JBS did not reply to our requests for an interview or a statement, but in response to similar claims in the Brazilian media in 2021, it said it had no tolerance for illegal deforestation, forced labour, misuse of indigenous lands, or violations of environmental embargoes. The company also said it had blocked more than 14,000 supplier farms for failure to comply with our policies and standards, and we will continue to take additional actions as warranted. But indigenous activists don't just blame the meat producers, they also point the finger at buyers and consumers elsewhere in the world.
You support indigenous genocide if you continue buying the meat that you know come from our territories.
Should Europe and North America be buying meat
Should be
from companies that are implicated in illegal deforestation?
Não, eu acho que não. Com certeza não. Porque enquanto houver quem compre produtos oriundos de desmatamento ilegal, haverá pressão dentro do Brasil para a produzir, né, nesses territórios com desmatamento. Então a gente também quer estabelecer uma cooperação muito forte internacional para nos ajudar nessa meta do desmatamento zero.
The situation is clearly out of control. According to Brazil's Indigenous Missionary Council, in 2021 there were almost 1,300 violent invasions of indigenous territories, often with the purpose of clearing land for cattle farming.
There has a long history of landowners and farmers working with armed militias to suppress indigenous rights with almost complete impunity, in some cases even with collusion with state forces.
Brazil's indigenous people have no alternative but to defend their land or perish. And defending the forest is a dangerous business.
Uma grande expressão de ameaça também por estar protegendo aquele território, né? Principalmente na questão que a gente tem o lugar sagrado de caçar, de coleta de castanha, onde ele estava desmatando para que possa criar gado. E isso nos afetou muito dentro do nosso território.
Estamos vendo também as ameaças aumentarem nos territórios indígenas, especialmente na região amazônica.
Perhaps the most notorious murder of an indigenous leader was the brutal killing of Ari Uruuwawau, whose badly beaten body was found on the side of a dirt track in 2020.
O Ari foi morto por defender a floresta. O Ari era um guardião da floresta. O Ari lutava para tirar os invasores ali da região do Burareiro, onde tem milhares de gado lá dentro que são gado ilegal.
Brazilian street artist Mundano has painted a tribute to Ari in the heart of Sao Paulo.
On the clouds above him, I painted several hundreds of names of indigenous and environmental activists that was murdered here in Brazil in the last 4 years during the Bolsonaro government.
Ari's murder has come to symbolize the gulf between those defending the forest and those exploiting it. But just as the indigenous peoples of Amazonia are threatened by those who invade their territory to raise cattle, so is everyone else. Of course, we all need food, but does that have to mean consuming the products of a profit-hungry meat industry?
We are eating the planet, right? Our planet is burning, our house is on fire, and these companies have the torch. So we really, really have to act.
This affects not only the biodiversity, the forest that we lost there, but our spirituality, our culture. Imagine, this is a secret place, and now we have only cattle there. We cannot change climate disaster, but we know that we can mitigate it. And the people in the European countries need to understand and learn with the indigenous peoples how we are connected with this planet.